Steve Stanek here, the Dusty Keratometer. I just wanted to do a follow-up video to my congratulatory video last week. Made some comments about boards. I said, you got this. Then two of my colleagues gave me feedback and said that my school in particular is having a terrible pass rate on part one of the national board. But largely, I stand behind my comments. The schools do a great job of preparing you. You know more than you think you know. I'm trying to offer some encouragement here. Maybe a few stories. I'll put the stories toward the end because you probably don't want to hear that. These old days. I promise it's not that we had to walk to school 2 miles uphill both ways in the snow. But they may be amusing. You may find them amusing, somewhat. It's sort of like an officer and a gentleman, the wall that Officer Candidate Seeger has to get over. It's a hurdle we all must deal with. This has been going on for forever. In '81, I remember reading in the Review of Optometry the controversies of people having trouble passing, particularly Part 1 of the National Board. And there was a fellow a year ahead of me at PCO that was actually suffering from back spasms from the stress. But I do like what Chuck Yeager said. You know, he was a test pilot. I fortunately got to meet him, and he signed his book for me. One time a journalist asked him if he was ever afraid that the plane would just explode. And he said something I think was very interesting and helpful. He said that could happen, but he would have no control over that happening or not. So he worried about stuff that he could control. If he had to land quickly, where would he land? If he had to get out of the aircraft quickly, how would he get out? That sort of thing. Because just worrying is only going to give you back spasms or ulcers and whatnot. So you need to prepare in how best you can. If there are any weak areas, obviously you're going to try to shore those up. Additional classes you can go to. I know the schools are doing that in some situations. A classmate of mine, her brother was 3 years ahead of us, and he was having a real problem with the national board. Well, he failed Part 1 and he failed Part 2. So when he took Part 3, he actually took all 3 parts together. The school didn't want him to do that because they said they'd never had anyone successfully do that. But believe it or not, he did. He passed all 3 parts. That's pretty phenomenal. I was blessed. We had a really good study group. We had three guys, and we just had the right chemistry for studying together. One time I invited my best friend to join us, so there were 4 of us, and unfortunately we kept getting off track on tangents and such. So we learned that the chemistry between the 3 of us, the original study group, was better. It was more synergistic. We got a lot more accomplished. So you got to be careful who you study with if you go that route. I felt kind of bad not inviting my best friend anymore to our study groups, but it just didn't work out. You got to have the right people and the right chemistry. I took the California State Board. One of the examiners told us at the beginning, he said, look, we're looking for minimum competence here. We're not looking for tertiary specialization. If a member of the public comes to see you for an eye exam, is the patient going to be able to leave with a pair of glasses they can see out of? And if the patient has pathology, are you going to detect it? That's basically what they're looking for. So, Dr. Hooten was a professor at my school, and he said that, you know, some of these guys that are politically connected in optometry, in the state organizations and whatnot, presidents and stuff, they're not necessarily the most clinically astute optometrists out there. I was very naive. I thought that these guys must be really cutting edge, you know. He told a fascinating story. He said frequently they would be, guys like that would be asked if they would like to write questions for a state board or whatever. So they would come to people like Dr. Hooten and ask if Dr. Hooten would write a few questions for him. So Dr. Hooten would agree, and he would always send them the questions. And he says it was great. Then he would sit back, and after a week or so, he'd get a phone call, and the doctor would say, you sent the questions, but where are the answers? And he did that specifically because he wanted to kind of bust their chops a little bit and say, well, aren't you a licensed optometrist, don't you know the answers? So then he would subsequently send the answers. But there is a lot of truth in this. A classmate of mine was taking a small state board, and it was given orally. And the doctor was showing the candidate some slides of fundi. And one was a central retinal vein occlusion, you know, typical bucket of blood appearance. Well, the examiner was saying to my classmate, well, wait a minute, if the vessel is occluded, why is there all this bleeding here? You know, so the examiner was confusing central retinal artery occlusion with central retinal vein occlusion. And I experienced this myself. One of my state boards, they showed slides. It was written, it was multiple choice. And there was a picture of a red eye, and it was really the conjunctiva. Which of the following is most likely the correct diagnosis? Bacterial keratitis or viral keratitis? They weren't showing the cornea. So I mean, they weren't showing staining, they weren't showing the cornea, they were showing the conjunctiva. So whoever wrote that question was confusing conjunctivitis with keratitis. The best example is my brother went to osteopathy school. And I don't know if this is true or not, this is third hand, but they had the student candidate examine a patient, and the proctor asked the candidate, okay, well, what do you think is wrong with the patient? And the student said, the candidate said, I think it's a case of acute carcinoma of the colon. And the proctor said, really? He said, well, how did you arrive at that diagnosis? So the student went over all of his findings. And so the proctor said, well, let me get back to you. It turns out that the proctor thought that the patient was suffering from appendicitis, but actually the patient was suffering from acute carcinoma of the colon. When I was at Travis Air Force Base, we did have a young gal come to us. She had the Air Force scholarship, and she was being assigned there. She came during the summer to scope out the place. And just as she was leaving, she informed me that she hadn't passed part 1 of the national boards. She'd passed part 2 and 3. So when she finally came there, I, of course, went to credentialing, and they allowed her to practice under provisional credentialing. I think we had to review her records and whatnot. She was almost like an extern because she was not fully licensed yet. So we gave her some extra time to study for the boards, part 1, when she retested it. She retested and failed again. So again, I had to go to credentialing, and the lady at credentials, very nice, said, well, we can extend her provisional credentialing for another 6 months. So that's what we did. Continued to review her records. Again, when the boards were approaching, we gave her time off to study, and she failed it again. So I had to go back to credentialing. Now it was becoming a little bit of a more serious situation because they actually had to ask for a special waiver from headquarters, if we can allow, I think from the Surgeon General's office, if we could allow this provisionally credentialed person to continue. And they did, fortunately. And finally, on the third try from there, at the third try at that point, which was really about her 5th or 6th attempt, she finally passed part 1. So as far as I know, I've never known anybody who didn't eventually pass, but that's a rather extreme case. And you feel for some of these people because some people don't take tests well and whatnot. So what can you do? I wish I had a simple answer for you, but I don't. I wish there was a magic bullet that I could give you to help you pass, but it's one of those things we just all have to deal with. I only bounced one check in my life, and it was the National Board of Optometric Examiners. It wasn't my fault because I was getting a stipend from the Army, and my bank in Philadelphia was depositing it in my checking account. For some reason, this one particular month, they decided to put it in my savings account. So I thought, oh my God, I'm never going to pass boards. But I called up the board, and the guy was real nice about it. He said, nah, just send us another check. But what was kind of funny, the next time when I looked at the board application, there was a thing on there. It said, if your check is returned, we're going to charge you a $25 fee. And I wondered if I was the cause of that.